So today we're going to talk a little bit about chapter number 8 of the story, which means that we're already more than a quarter of the way done through this Bible survey, which consists of 31 chapters. And chapter 8 of the story is basically a condensed version of the book of Judges. The time frame of Judges happens after the people enter into the Promised Land. We read that last week under Joshua, but before the nation of Israel is unified under a single king. So it's this sort of nebulous in-between phase for the Israelites, where they're in the land, but they're not quite together yet as a nation. And what we find in the book of Judges is that it's basically a cycle of behavior between God and the Israelites, where it starts with the Israelites doing evil in the eyes of God. We read this over and over again. The people do evil in God's eyes. They in particular seem to fall into worshiping other gods. We read about Baal and Asherah. Then as a result of this, God hands them over to their enemies. We read about Moab and Midian and the Philistines. And so the people become oppressed by their enemies as a result of their sin. And then as a result of that oppression, they cry out to God. And so God raises up certain individuals, certain heroes basically, who are called judges, to save the people and to crush their enemies. Othniel and Ehud and Deborah and Gideon and Samson and a lot of others. And these characters are very colorful and interesting and often very messy. So anyway, once this judge defeats whoever the enemy of the day is, the people go back to worshiping God for a little while until the cycle sort of repeats itself, and then they fall right back into worshiping other gods. So this is kind of the cycle of Judges. There are lots of individual stories, but that's kind of the big pattern. And what's really amazing in this pattern of people's unfaithfulness is that God doesn't abandon them or give them up. He never lets the people finally get washed away into oblivion. God keeps on coming after them. So in chapter 8 of the story, we get a picture of God's faithfulness to his people. Remember, God had said to Moses, "I am gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness." And we get a picture of that faithfulness. But God also said, "I don't leave the guilty unpunished." And the book of Judges shows us both of those aspects of God's dealing with his people. He doesn't let them get wiped away. He had promised to Abraham, "Your descendants will become a great nation and all peoples will be blessed through them." And yet, individual generations of these people are unfaithful to God and sin against him, and so those generations fall under punishment. Judges is a great book, but it's also a challenging book. The stories in it are interesting, they're engaging, they're colorful, they're sometimes shocking. We talked last week about how the book of Joshua has some significantly violent parts of it, and the book of Judges certainly also has very violent portions of it. We can think of Jael with the tent peg in Sisera's head. We can think of Ehud with his dagger going into Eglon's rotund belly. And it's partly these violent passages that make the book of Judges challenging. But it's also the fact that for Christians, there's the not so easy to answer question of what does this have to do with Christianity and what does it have to do with Jesus Christ? The answer is not immediately obvious. Maybe we just begin by saying, well, the book of Judges shows that God takes sin seriously. And that's not a bad place to start. The Israelite pattern of turning constantly away from God shows us something about human nature that we still experience, which is the tendency to turn away from God's will or to step off of God's path. But then, like we already mentioned, in Judges, we see that God amazingly doesn't let his people go, but raises up a savior of a certain kind to bring his people out of their mess. And that shows us something about God that comes to fullness later when in Jesus Christ, God raises up a savior of a particular kind to save his people from their mess and even to save them from sin and death itself. So the book of Judges shows us something about human nature and the universal need for a savior. And that's part of a big, grand question that the New Testament answers in the person of Jesus Christ.